David was confused. Was I supposed to understand that? He asked to no one in particular. The device was making all kinds of noises in his ear, which he eventually realized must have been different languages. There were a couple that sounded almost like something he might have heard before, but most were complete gibberish. This went on for several minutes. Unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, English wasn't on the list. Although, to be fair, the sound quality was quite good for how small the device was. He was able to listen to the couple dozen utterly exotic languages in crystal clear, high-definition audio. But, if the device was supposed to have helped him comprehend the four-armed being's language, it apparently wasn't working. Being number 2 seemed to realize this as well. It removed their own device, inspecting it closely. Then it walked over and held out its hand to David. He gave the earpiece back and watched, while being number 2 fiddled with it for a bit. After a moment, it handed the earbud back to David and waited to start talking until he had it back in his ear. Still nothing but more meaningless noise and sounds. "Yeah, sorry, I don't think it's working," David said, lowering his hand and letting the device fall into his palm. He noticed as he spoke that being number 3, who was still holding Red Shirt by the door, recoiled a little, but being number 2 tried to remain steadfast. To its credit, it mostly did, with the smallest flinch of its lower 2 arms being the only thing to give it away. As being number 2 took the earbud back from David, it turned and started talking to its 2 companions. The tone of its voice was different than before, not quite as hard or serious. Being number 3 spoke for the first time, appearing to address being number 2 directly. As the 2 newcomers seemingly discussed the situation, David's little friend limped over to him. Resting its lower left arm on his shoulder, Red Shirt crossed its upper arms over its chest and placed its hands on its own lower limbs. It looked at David first, then back at the other 2 beings as they continued talking. David wasn't sure if it was intentionally trying to make him feel better, but he realized that he really appreciated the gesture. He found it surprisingly reassuring that his little friend appeared to be a bit more comfortable around him now. At the very least, it made David feel a little less isolated. Apparently, having reached some decision, being number 3 stepped forward and spoke. Being number 2 didn't look entirely pleased, but said nothing, and instead walked out of the barn. Whatever being number 3 had to say was apparently directed at Red Shirt, who didn't say much in return, but started walking towards the door. It stopped halfway there and turned around to look at David. It seemed to be thinking and did a funny motion with its lower jaws. Then it did something that almost made David break out into honest laughter, in spite of everything that had happened. He didn't though, thinking that if his voice made his hosts uncomfortable, him laughing probably wouldn't go over too well either. In what David could only describe as a scene right out of a classic kid finds an alien movie, Red Shirt pointed at him with both upper arms and then gestured to the floor with his lower set. It held that pose for a second before changing to point at itself and then the door. It pushed its head forward slightly, still looking at David. With the beginnings of a genuine smile on his face, David nodded his head and repeated the process back at his little friend. After he finished, Red Shirt clapped his lower limbs together and made an upside-down U-shaped motion with its upper hands. David interpreted this as a good thing. As the little guy limped over to being number 3, they started talking as they exited the barn. Being number 3 was gesturing at Red Shirt's injured leg and several small cuts on its arms and torso. Just before shutting the door, Red Shirt leaned back in and pointed to a little box on the wall by the door, then at the lights overhead. Flashing a thumbs up out of habit before realizing that it wouldn't know what that meant, David repeated the pointing procedure, first at the little box by the door, then at the lights. With another quick upside-down U-shaped wave of its upper hand, Red Shirt stepped out and closed the door. As the footsteps and voices faded, David was left alone in the deafening silence of the barn. As he sat there, David could feel himself coming down from whatever survivalist-fueled high he'd been on for the past few hours. Apparently, he had been in crisis mode without even realizing it, and he was finally starting to relax. Whether it was because he actually felt safe or because he was just too tired to keep it going, he wasn't sure. Leaning gingerly back against the wall so as to not make more of a mess, he rested his head against it, looked up, closed his eyes, and let out a long breath. "Goddamn, I'm tired." The events of the day were all catching up to him at once. David realized that he would have liked to have asked for some food and water, but it was too late now. He didn't want to trouble his hosts any more than he already had. Not to mention, he had no idea how he would even ask for it. The language barrier is going to make getting home really difficult. David was surprised by his own thought. "Home?" David spoke softly to the empty barn. It hadn't even crossed his mind since he had woken up on the forest floor, which now felt like ages ago. More evidence that he really had been in crisis mode. But now, as he had the time to slowly digest the frankly overwhelming amount of information he'd absorbed today, reality started to set in. David was no longer in the same state or the same country or even on the same continent that he'd been on yesterday. Hell, at this point, he wasn't even sure if this was Earth, a thought that really scared him. He had no idea how he had ended up here, where here actually was, or why he hadn't woken up in his own bed this morning. There were so many unknown variables in the equation that was his life right now that it was staggering. David must have been exhausted because he thought he was taking this pretty well, all things considered. His brain felt fried, the same feeling he got after cramming for a test, but way worse. He felt himself start to drift off to sleep, but forced himself awake. He was still sitting against the thin wall, and he was worried that he'd cause more damage if he fell asleep on it. He thought about sleeping outside on the grass. It had felt comfortable enough the last time he'd involuntarily slept on it, but ultimately decided against it. Too many unknowns out there for his taste. After all, he had no idea what went bump in the night around here. Testing the floor of the barn, he found that, while he had initially just assumed it was concrete, it was something else entirely. It felt a lot like the firm pieces of foam that they used to line the floors of daycare centers, with just a little bit of give to it, but without the fun colors and shapes. David shrugged. "I've slept on worse, I guess." He crawled over on his hands and knees and turned off the lights. Returning to the center of the now moonlit alcove, he laid down on his side and gathered his hands underneath his head. It wasn't great, but it would do for now. Besides, he was so tired that he felt himself falling asleep almost the moment he closed his eyes. Funnily enough, his last conscious thoughts before falling into a light but dreamless sleep weren't about his family or his home, but instead about his new little friend. "I sure hope its ankle isn't hurting too badly." Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.